and probably the middle of November, as long as we get it done that quick. All right, our next program is November 17th with Patricia West McKay, and once John comes up, he'll elaborate a little bit more on the topic of that, because he knows more about what Patty's going to talk about than I could ever explain. December 8th, we're going to have our annual open house. It's from 1 to 3:30. We're working on a new exhibit on the RCS school system centralization that will start from the merger of Arena and Coeymans and bring it to modern day. So look forward to that, and hopefully you'll all come out and visit us that day. Today, John will speak on the 1906 Coeymans Brickyard Riots. It's always nice when one of our own members speaks on a local topic. Last year, if you remember, John spoke about Jacob Parrish, which drew interest from even outside the area. When he was doing his presentation, he had a portrait of Jacob Parrish, and we ended up hearing from some guy who actually owned the portrait. So who knows what will come out of today's talk? You never know. John's been a trustee here at RCS for the past 13 years. In addition to doing research and presentation, he created those timeline panels that you see. He created the panel that we have on enslavement and the one we have on the Revolutionary War. So if you haven't seen them, make sure you come in December and look at them. John holds a BA in Fine Arts and a Master's in Public History from the University of Albany. He also taught a graduate course in Historic Preservation for over 20 years at that location. He retired in 2021 from New York State Office of Historic Preservation, where he served for more than 3 decades as Program Director, Architectural Historian, and the agency's Historic Preservation Officer. He's been responsible for researching and writing more than 500 nomination documents for properties in historic districts here in New York State for the National Register of Historic Places. So please welcome John as he talks today about the Coeymans Brickyard.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon. I always like when it rains when I talk because it always brings out more people. So, what Joe had mentioned, Patty West, who grew up here, went to school here. She's been a friend of mine for a very long time. We co-taught at SUNY Albany. She was actually the head curator and education director at Martin Van Buren for a number of years, as well as a number of other sites. Really interesting speaker. Her dad worked for Atlantic Cement in the early 60s, so again, she's about my age, went to school here with contemporaries, although I was at St. Pat's, Patty was here, and we often talk about her being Coeymans and her recollections. She actually wrote her dissertation back in the late 90s and published it called Domesticated History of the Historian's Journal, and she tracked 4 historic sites, and one of them being Mount Vernon, another being Orchard House, which is Louisa May Alcott, Little Women's house she grew up in, and where the book is set, and Monticello and another site. And what Patty and I were talking about last year that led to her talk is the fact that we're bemoaning the fact that you can't have a Thanksgiving dinner anymore without having a really long table to separate people. And the idea that that's something culturally new, and it's not. So in Patty's book, she talks about how when Mount Vernon was created as a museum, the Civil War, we were on the eve of the Civil War, and trying to get northern donors and southern donors and politicians to come together to save Mount Vernon as the war got closer became the same kind of thing. Similarly, with Orchard House, Louisa May Alcott's house, suffrage was the topic of the day. And again, board members were suffragettes and rabid non-suffragettes, and trying to bring these sites together to create these sites we think of today as great historic sites. Patty's talk will remind us about the history of those sites and hopefully give us a little more insight and hope that as time goes on, the table can get shorter again and we can go back to just the way things should be. So Looking forward to having Patty here November
17th.
17th. So please join us. She's a really great speaker, and it'll be fun to talk to Patty, and there may be some chance for interaction as a historian. She likes to engage her audiences, and so it should be a fun afternoon. Which brings us to the events of 1906. Now, when I started work at the state 30 years ago, there was a labor historian named Vic DeSanto. And Vic had done his dissertation, his PhD work on Albany labor, particularly the Union Traction strike of 1901. But he came over to me with a bunch of Xerox copies of news articles, and they were all about this strike in Coeymans. This is about 1988 or 89, which I had never heard of growing up here. Having family who worked in the brickyards, never heard about it. And it kind of always stuck in my head that it really would be a good talk someday. So someday is now here. And as I began digging into the research, what I found and what I'll impart with you today is that the history of this event, you can tell the story from the news articles and tell just that story. But to understand the story, you kind of need to go back and learn about 3 different things to kind of get to what happened in 1906. And those include, we need to understand brick making. You know, what is the process? You know, what's the labor involved? What's the process of bricks becoming bricks? Then you need to look at immigration, because that's the other leg of our 3-leg milking stool here. The third leg is labor history, and particularly union history. And all of those things are going to kind of collide in Coeymans, but also in New York State and other places around the country at about the same time. This is a very volatile period in American history. The late 19th century, the first decade or so of the 20th century, there's an awful lot of things going on. So we're going to kind of build up to 1906 and then talk specifically about how that happens. And we will zip through that as best we can. So I mentioned to some folks, we'll have a couple of great pictures from the brickyards. This one I pulled out, it's from my family's photos. My grandfather is the tall guy there, and my uncle, who's about 16, is standing here, Tommy, and they worked their whole lives in the brickyard. My grandfather probably started working in the yards right around 1906. Tommy, this picture is probably about 1920 or so. So we have a family connection to this story as we go forward. So when we talk about 1906, what are the other stories of the day? And we kind of forget, 1906, just a few months before the riots, the San Francisco earthquake hit. So we have a major a city, you know, in flames and in ruins, and recovery going on with that. At the same time, Mount Vesuvius had erupted in Naples, so we've got a couple of 100,000 Italians being displaced by Vesuvius, wiping out villages there. And not to be outdone, the Queen of Italy has posted a reward for any successful aeronaut who can take their balloon over the Alps. So while we're talking about events that are very, forward in our memories in terms of history, this is also a time when cars are not prevalent. There aren't airplanes. We're still traveling in balloons if we want to get over the top of something. So, again, it's all about context. The other piece of context I'll throw out there right now is a lot of news articles are going to be flashed up on the screen. 1906, our cultural thoughts about society are very different. So how the papers report on Italians and how the papers report on African Americans and the names and terms used are very different than we would use today. So when those come up, just understand we're showing them in context. Okay, that's my disclaimer. So brick making. Very quickly, we've been making bricks as human beings for thousands of years. The Egyptians painted this 4,000 years ago. And the process has not changed an awful lot going into the early 20th century. You take clay, you mold it. You can see the little statuette on the bottom that was found in a tomb, shows a guy who's unmolding bricks out of a mold. Same process made this brick. So we haven't, the process is not dramatically different. And in looking at ways to kind of infuse to people what that process looks like from these early days right up until probably the mid-19th century, even a little bit later, I found a small video clip which shows brick making in Bangladesh. This is modern. So you're basically harvesting clay from a clay bank. That clay is then being carried by carts to a pug mill, which is either driven by a horse, or in this case a gas engine, and later on an industrial engine. That clay is mixed with water in that pug mill, and eventually it's all being extruded out the bottom. It's being kind of homogenized and softened, and the air is being compressed out of it to the point that it's plasticine. And you guys just take that now homogenized mix, and we'll eventually be packing it one brick at a time into molds. The molds have to be sanded and wet in order to get the mud out of it. And then they're sat, in this case in Bangladesh, they bake them in the sun. Here we're going to bake them in kilns. This is the process which was used by the Egyptians, and it's the same process they were using making bricks in Coeymans right up until the mid-19th century. So things haven't changed a lot. That mid-century point, 1850, we have 3 brick makers in Coeymans identified in the census of 1850. Sylvester Harris has 21 men. He's producing about 2 million bricks during the brick making season. He's using horsepower. Peter Seabridge, the same, 21 men, 2 million bricks, horsepower. And Jacob Sickler has fewer men, 15. He's making fewer bricks. Why? Because there's fewer hands to make mold and unmold brick. Jacob Sickler is interesting. Here's the 1950 census. You can see Jacob, his family members, and then all the laborers here. They're all Canadian. They're living with Jacob on the brickyard. You know, it was the first time I had seen Canadian labor here, but in the same census, there's also Canadian labor working in the stone yards out in Coeymans Hollow. So at that point, there was this transient Canadian labor coming down and probably going back during the brick season, and for whatever time they spent at the quarries as well. But I thought Canadians were interesting in 1850. The clay banks of the Hudson River, not unlike what we saw in Bangladesh. These are Plasticine era banks of clay that are laid down. There's not stone in it. It's under kind of that top layer of soil. It's undisturbed, and it's harvested the way you would dig out anything else. They're taking axe like those guys were. They're hacking it out. They're putting it in carts and bringing it to the brickyard where it's going onto its next phase, where it would go into a pug mill driven by the horse we saw in the census, the 1850 horsepower. It's going in the top. The plasticine clay is coming out the bottom, and that's being put into molds by hand, or wedged, as it's called. That's wedging. And when you wedge a brick mold, then you have to strike it to get the excess clay off the top. So there's a bunch of different actions going on. And then you put it out in the sun to bake. So 1846, a fellow named Alfred Hall, who was from Coxsackie, he's a brickmaker there, he invents a machine that actually includes a pug mill and a brick press. So now you can dump the stuff in the top, the horse is going to walk around, extrude that clay into a mold, which you're going to strike off, hand to a guy who's going to empty them. So we've enhanced the speed of the process. What used to be about 1,500 brick, or 1,000 brick a day, with Alfred's press, he was now getting up to somewhere around 2,000 brick a day. Actually, according to his advertising, 2 men and 2 boys could do 1,500 bricks a day with the Alfred Hall press. A couple years later, Richard Vervallen, who's a Haverstraw brickmaker, patents his brick-making machine. What makes his different is the advent of the steam engine. No more horses to worry about getting hit in the head by. The steam engine is driving a belt drive, which is a long shaft that you hook belts up to, as you see here. That's driving the machine. You still got to put clay into the machine. You still got to move bricks in and out of the machine and get them to the yard, but you can produce them much quicker. So now all of a sudden, you can produce several thousand bricks a day, not just 1,500. The first automated brickyard using steam in the Hudson Valley was in Haverstraw. It was a Turcotte yard in 1873. Steam also then led to steam shovels, which eliminated the need to hand dig the clay, because the steam shovel could do that work, and trolleys driven by small steam engines that could now carry clay to the pug mills and actually you could work greater distances away from where your brickyard was set up by using these new innovations, all of which were, certainly steam shovels were being used at the Coeymans yards during that period. The other innovation is something called the temper mill. This gets rid of the pug mill. Everything gets dumped into a 30-foot diameter pit. The wheel is being driven by steam, and as it goes around overnight into the stuff that's been dumped into the pit, it produces the same effect as a pug mill. And what are they putting in the pit? They're putting clay, they're putting water. In upstate New York, they're using sand because of the nature of the clay in upstate, and they're adding pulverized coal to the mix. Why would you add pulverized coal to a brick? Because it burns, right? So when you're firing a brick now, when you fire a brick, you don't have to fire it for 14 days in the kiln. It's actually being fired internally at the same time by that anthracite coal that's burning inside of it. So now you can get a brick burned in half the time, 7 days. So anthracite became kind of a standard thing to use to help speed up the clay process. Once again, it's not about making labor any less laborious. It's about producing more brick. The guys you've got working the yard are still molding as many bricks as they can mold, and you're still firing as many as you can fire. It's about more product, more product, more profit. So, again, now we've got a full steam process going on here. This happens to be Haverstraw. You've got a guy working his press. You've got somebody putting the molds, which are these guys, ready to go into the machine to have bricks pressed into them. And you've got this guy who's unmolding them onto a pallet, a flat piece of flat board, as you see here. Here's 6 bricks just unmolded. They're going on conveyors out to the yard to be put out for drying. Again, 4 guys working the machine. You've got guys in the yard doing what they do. In Sutherland's yard, we've got indoor machines working. Again, 4 guys working a machine. You can see the conveyor system. For those of you who remember the old AMP that used to be here, they'd send your groceries out the window on one of these contraptions. So they're just sending stuff out to the yard where those guys are working to flip the bricks onto the yard. The guy you see that's kind of moving, so you can't see his, he's obviously in motion for the photo, is a young kid. And as you can see, there's belts and pulleys and wheels all over this system. So OSHA had not quite found its way into the system yet. And again, more bricks produced, more labor needed, again, just to keep the yards moving and the product going. When we talk about brickyards, we're talking about large pieces of property by the late 1900s. Brickyards are very scientific in their construction. They're not just flat pieces of ground. You've got, to excavate the yard, you have to compact blue clay, and then you compact pulverized yellow clay, and then you have to roll the entire thing completely smooth. It's akin to a billiard table, they say. It's that smooth and flat and perfect, pitched just slightly so water can run off. Every day when the brickyard starts operating, they dust it with fine sand to keep feet from the bricks from sticking to the surface. And then anyone working the brickyard, that's a brickyard, usually is doing it barefoot. Because again, heels will mar that surface. So that surface has to stay completely smooth and flat for the process to work. Brickyards, for one of those machines we saw, each brickyard for a machine is about 180 feet wide by 475 feet long. There'll be multiple yards for every machine. When you're done, when those bricks come out of the conveyor, they're laid down flat. You can see this is all brick that's been produced in a day. It's laid flat down. It's going to be flat for a couple hours while it dries on 5 sides, around the sides and on the top. After those few hours, they're going to send a bunch of guys out, usually kids, and those kids are going to edge the bricks. They're going to flip them up on its side. That's going to let the bottom of the brick now dry. Once that's all done, you're going to take those bricks, you're going to stack them in these hacks, which are these things that are sitting behind the boys here. And those are just walls, 1 brick thick, a couple of fingers between it. Now they just continue to dry for a couple days. And that goes on until they're dry enough to bring in and build a kiln with. At the Sutton Sutherland yard, these are the yards that existed for Sutton and Sutherland. You can see this is a massive operation. This is not a small brickyard. They're not producing 1 million bricks. They're producing millions and millions of bricks. And each of these yards represents a machine. You can see the machines by those little roofs that are almost look like they're sideways. That's a separate brick machine. That's a crew of 4 guys pumping out bricks every day, 10, 14 hours a day. When the bricks are ready to finish drying in the hack, they're brought inside by wheelers who put bricks onto a wheelbarrow and wheel them in. They're then handed to guys who are setters, and the setters are the guys usually up on top. They're getting bricks thrown to them, 3 and 4 of these at a time, stacked up. They're being hoisted up to the guy who's setting brick. And they're heavier than this is because they're still wet. They haven't been burned yet. And the setters are building these massive kilns. The kilns generally were 20 feet high, about 36 feet wide, and about 120 feet long. And every so often there'd be a channel allowed through, and that's where coal fires are being set. So once the kiln is ready to burn, it's loaded with coal. Again, this is another shot of a Sutton Sutterly kiln being built. The wheelers and the setter above. Well, actually, a pretty young guy, actually. Once the kiln's ready to burn, it's completely covered in clay, and then the kiln foreman will light the fires on the outside, move them in and out, maintain the heat, and watch the steam for several days coming off the top of the kiln. The steam is the water coming out of the brick. When the steam is over, the coals are raked out, the kiln's allowed to come down in temperature, and then they reverse the process. They peel it all away. So all the bricks that had clay stuck to them, discarded, and then they begin pulling it down brick by brick, 3 and 4 being dropped to a wheeler at a time. This time the wheeler's taking them out to a waiting barge that's going to bring them down to New York City, where they'll be stacked probably on Pier 68 or so, where all construction goods go, and the price for brick will be set and sold. We'll talk more about that aspect of it. All in all, 19 brickyards in Coeymans over 1850 through the 1920s. Most of them are very short-lived for a couple reasons. It's hard work, it's hard to get labor, the price of brick fluctuates too much to make it really profitable. So only a couple survived. 5 will survive into the 20th century. Here's a news article, 1886. Sutton and Sutterly are opening their new yard. John Sutton was responsible for building the yard. He was an older gentleman, will die about 1896. His daughter will marry Conrad Sutterly. That's where Sutton and Sutterly come in. 1886, they've opened their first yard. They've put in their horizontal steam engine. They're capable of producing about 44,000 bricks a day at the new yard, which had just opened. And similarly, Powell and Minnick will open their yard in May of 1906, where their first pit they've burned their first pit being their first clay assembly from the pit wheel they were creating. So that's our brick history. Now we know there's labor. 44,000 bricks a day in a brickyard is a lot to produce. It's not coming from local labor. It's also hard labor. So what a lot of the brickyards have been doing, you've got men coming down from Canada, you're also bringing black workers up from the south. That was kind of the first iteration of seasonal labor. There's Temec Powell's father, Trip Powell's grandfather, has a recorded interview where he talks about they would go down to Virginia and sign men up. And they book so many train cars and bring the men up every year about the same time. And in the early years, right around the turn of the century, in order for the men who were working the plantations down in Virginia to come up and work the brick, they had to be signed off on by whoever owned the plantation to make sure that they weren't taking work away from southern plantation owners. So a lot of the guys would come up from that May to September season and then go back down south and continue working wherever they were. Come around the turn of the century, it's still not enough labor. And we see, if we compare it to Italian immigration during the period, you can see the era from 1903 to about 1907. About 1.5 million Italian immigrants. It's the high point of Italian immigration. So labor becomes readily available from this source as well. And what happens in most immigration stories, just as it does here, somebody comes here from a town, they see there's plentiful work, they call back or they reach back through letters to their families, and more people from their village come over. That's kind of what's happening. So the brickyards had labor. The Italians who came here probably to initially begin working the rail yards, start working the brickyards. More people come, more people come, more people come. When we break down Italian immigration in the town of Coeymans, and this is looking at just male labor. So these are the people that if you go through the census records, they'll show either as labor railroad or labor brickyard. Some people just show as labor. I don't count them because I don't know where they're working. But just based on those numbers, we start by looking at Irish immigration and Italian immigration. Irish immigration is kind of orangey color. You can see from 1850 right on through, you kind of peak about 1892, and then it begins to drop off. It drops off because we don't have as many people coming directly from Ireland to Coeymans to do work. So by this time, second generations are happening. They're not identified in the census as being born in Ireland, they're born in America. You can see the Italian immigration and its escalation. Again, this is counting workmen as they come over and are identified as being born overseas. And you can see how it really eclipses. So this idea of labor in this community, bringing more people in, you can see how it builds pretty steadily. When we look at where these guys are all working, blue is the brickyard, that orangey color is the railroad, quarries are green, and that light blue is the state road. In 1915, the state road kind of took half the brickyard workers, and I think it was probably the construction of either 143 or 9W. But for that one snapshot in the census, there were all these Italian immigrants working on the state road. You can see how it drops from the brickyards. So let's get to labor. This is the third leg of that stool. And will probably be the most decisive one. So at the close of the 19th century and into the early years of the 20th century, the labor unionizing had really kind of reached its zenith at that point. And at the same time, brickmaking is reaching its peak. Between 1880 and 1905, the number of Hudson Valley brickyards had grown by 50%, and production of brick had gone up by 350%. A lot of this has to do with all those immigrants coming and a lot of new construction in New York City to house them. Plus you have a lot of new buildings going up in New York City. And this is just on the edge before reinforced concrete is coming into vogue. So brick is in massive supply at that point. When we talk about national labor, it's also a point of volatility. 1892, the Homestead Steel Strike, which brought out the Pinkertons, which was literally a battle, a labor battle. 1894, the Pullman Strike. Grover Cleveland calls out 10,000 U.S. troops to put the union labor rioters down, to pacify them. 1900, we've got the St. Louis Transit Strike. 3,000 workers go out, closing St. Louis's transit hubs for a while, and also leading to the death of 14 workers who were shot. 1901, Albany, the Union Transit Strike, which Bill Kennedy talks about, I think, in Albany. Shuts down the trolley lines in Albany. 2 men are killed by, actually 2 non-union guys, but 2 shop owners end up being shot by National Guardsmen who were called out to try to protect the rail yards. And in 1902, there's a variety of coal strikes going on. The first we hear about labor in the Hudson Valley relating to brickyards is 1853 in Haverstraw. And it's kind of humorous because the Haverstraw yards are the biggest in the Hudson Valley, they always will be. But in 1852, the workers walk off their jobs seeking not more pay but lesser hours. And so modern an idea is a strike that the Rockland County Messenger actually has to use a dictionary definition of a strike to explain to people what's going on, which I found really, really humorous that, you know, we think of a strike, we know what a strike is, 1852, 53, they had no idea. So it was this novel idea of men walking out for more money, but they really just wanted shorter hours. Come forward a little bit into the late 19th century, and now we've got the Rockland Messenger here reporting on the coming together of the New York and New Jersey brick manufacturers into an association. And it's kind of, you know, it's a group of guys who own these brickyards who are concerned about the volatility in the price market. Right after the Civil War, the price of bricks actually hit $20 a thousand. By this time, we're down to about $7 a thousand. So that's a huge swing, and brick prices are swinging like this on a regular basis. So the brick manufacturers get together in an effort to kind of control price fixing. So they decide, some of the ideas are, we're going to stop producing bricks for a whole year, which of course will drive the price up because there'll be no supply. They're also talking about starting the brick season later, ending it sooner, I think not to run afoul of Congress. It's just a shorter season, which will also reduce the supply considerably. In the end, they all couldn't come to consensus, and they all walked away from the table. 1902, the 126 Hudson River manufacturers formed the Hudson River Brickmakers Association. And they meet monthly, and they're actually talking about ways to kind of manipulate prices and brick manufacturing numbers and how to better control and manage the price of brick. 1905, brick reaches its height since the Civil War of about $8 to $10, $10.50, $11 per thousand. And that's for top quality brick, your Croton brick and really hard fired brick. Coeymans would be a little lesser than that. 1906, the price creeps up to 12. So now you've got labor, production, price is high. It's kind of the perfect storm, you know, for labor and workers and price to come together. By 1908, the price would drop again to $5 a thousand. So it's a very volatile market. 1905, towards the end of 1905, the first strike occurs in the Upper Valley. That's the Malley Brickyards in Beacon. And they're mostly Syrian, Irish, Polish, and black workers. They walk off the job at the W.D. Budd Brickyard. They're demanding 25 cents a day to augment their $2 a day pay, which is for a 14-hour day. They march and shut down 14 yards in Beacon. The owners report that they're being assaulted by a mob of workers. But the next day, they give the workers a 20-cent increase to get back to work. So it's kind of the first time we see a successful strike where money is involved. That brings us to 1906, which gets us to kind of the point of the talk. 1906 is going to be a volatile year for a lot of industry, and particularly the brickyards. And in particular, Coeymans is going to undergo some rapid change as a result of all of these forces coming together. So the first thing that happens, which is not in Coeymans, but kind of affects and talks about the impact brickmaking can have in the community, is Haverstraw on the evening of January 8th, 1906 at 11 o'clock. The brickyards in Haverstraw, again, the largest in the Hudson Valley, have been mining brick for about 30 or 40 years on the banks of the Hudson. They have literally tunneled under parts of Beacon to get the clay out because the easy clay is all gone. So in tunneling it, they didn't shore the mines properly. And on that evening, the entire works collapsed. It took out 3 city blocks, killed 19 people, and 14 houses were destroyed in the process. On January of the same year, the next day, local union 193 of the Brick Tile Terracotta Workers Alliance is organized in Coeymans. The Brick Tile Terracotta Workers Alliance is the national union. They're centered out of Chicago. They're trying to unionize Hudson Valley brick workers. And Coeymans establishes its first local, which is 193. Its president is Charles Hazelton. Its vice president is James Delmonico, both of Coeymans. So now the union has been established in Coeymans. It's not been accepted by the brickyards, but the men are unionizing under their own efforts in hopes of pushing better conditions at the brickyards. That brings us to the handout I gave you, which is January 22nd. I think probably in response to the unionization. John Sutterly, 22-year-old John Sutterly, who is partners with his dad in this in Sutton Sutterly, drafts this contract. All workers who live in Sutterly housing, all brickyard housing, which most of these laborers who are, coming over from Italy, have no place to live. Most people won't rent to them in the hamlet, so they're living in company housing. Well, they're each given this contract to sign, just as you see it. Most of them can't read English. Most of them could read English, probably couldn't read that. I read that and went, what? And before they can enter housing, they must sign the contract, where they can't live in company housing. If you're one of the guys who's coming over to the brickyards to work, you have no other housing choices, so you have to sign it. It requires $3 a month in your rent, and according to the contract, it's okay if you take in boarders. Each boarder is going to pay $3 a month in rent too. If you read the national, when we talk about the brick and tile workers, I was going to call them the union. The union publication in July of 1906 that's recounting the history of the events in Coeymans publishes that contract and talks about the fact that that's not the case. It's not voluntary. The company is going to tell you which guys are living with you. They're just going to put guys in your building. And that's, there is no choice. They're going to pay $3 a month. The end result of that is fairly significant. And this is some of the Sutterly housing. This is from the 60s, these photos. This is when they were about to be torn down. So the housing was probably in obviously much better shape, although I've got pictures of my grandfather standing in front of his house, and it really didn't look a lot different. And this is actually the house he lived in. It didn't look a lot different than this.
Where are these, John? Where are these located?
These are located down where the Baptist church is. So they're in a hollow. We'll see them in another slide. So this is called the Bottoms. But there's housing at all of these various brickyards, whether they're former stables or whether they're rudimentary barracks. These guys are all paying $3 rent to live there. And in some cases, the rent is kind of substantial. When you look at this fellow, which is Gabriel Securo, and we're going to hear about Gabe Securo again. If any of you are old enough like me, you remember the Securo sisters, Genevieve and Rose. I think this is their father. We're going to talk about Gabriel later on. But you can see he's got 12 boarders living with him and his 2-year-old daughter. I'm sure he didn't want 12 people living in his house with him. And these houses aren't that big, and he's probably living on one flat. So they're probably 2 flats or more per building. So it's a lot of guys to be crammed into a building for several months at a time. And they're all paying $3 a month to the brick owners. So it's a substantial, $3 a month doesn't sound like a lot. When you make it 12 people, it's adding up that the brickyard is actually, the owners are making some money, although to the union they claim they were making not a penny on this deal. For the Southern black workers, it's even kind of more ridiculous in many ways. Samuel Oliver here, who is a single guy, he's the head of house. This is a 1905 census, as the last one was. He's got 36 men living in one house with him, and they're all paying $3 a head. That's the equivalent of $4,000 for an apartment today that the Sutterlys are getting from this housing a month. So it's lucrative. So who are our players? Our players are Conrad Sutterly, the owner of Sutton Sutterly, his son John Sutterly. This is the Sutterly home, which is on the corner of Westerlo Street and Colvin. Still there today. You can see it at the bottom corner. The other player in this drama is Justin Bishop. Justin is the superintendent of works at Sutton and Sutterly, but he is also a son-in-law to John Sutton as well. So, there's a family connection. And his home today, you can see here, which is on Blaisdell, right across the street from Joe's house. This is the riverside front of the house, but these are, nice homes. These fellows are doing fine. The other players are the union workers. So we've got Frank Butterworth. He's the second vice president of the International Union. He's from Philadelphia. We've got Charles Hank. He is the international president. He's from Chicago. And our local leader, local president, Charles Hazelton, in the center there. The first strike in Coeymans, April 7th. The men walk out. They walked out on April 1st. There's no demands listed. 200 men walked off their jobs at the brickyards. They didn't return until April 6th. Southern black workers have not yet arrived at the yards, so there's a small group of men beginning the process of getting the yards ready for production. These are the guys who walk out. I'm guessing that the walk-off, because the union has just been established in January, I'm guessing they're walking off to try to get the union recognized by the brickyards, which it is not. Again, going back to that original agreement by all the brick manufacturers when they got together and created their association, we'll accept any changes you want to make at your various yards. You cannot ever let the union come into the yards, period. That was the one caveat all the owners agreed to. Also at this time, Kingston yards walk off. Kingston, another large brick manufacturing area in the Hudson River. They return with a 15-cent a day increase, which is about $5.25 today. So they're brought back. The Coeymans workers just go back to work without any indication that what their terms were. Clearly nothing was given to them at that point. May 6th, the Coeymans workers again walk off the job. May 7th, Mr. Butterfield from Philadelphia comes to Coeymans to meet with the union. They meet at Adamo Tavern. And at that point, he reports in the Union Journal that the union in Coeymans is thriving. With, virtually everyone has joined the union, how incredible that is. In talking to Butterworth, the workers tell him that they were locked out of their jobs on May 6th. When Butterworth supposedly talks to the owners, they say the men walked off. On May 10th, Sutterly issues a letter to all the workers that have walked off the job that you will hereby be requested to return to work together with all men living in our houses or vacate them at once. So again, that's the contract. You're living in a house, they don't like what you're doing, you're out of the house. Because there's no 30 days, there's no court involved, you have no place to live. So the next day, all the workers return as directed in the letter. On May 12th, the following day, they all walk off the job again. They've come back, they met the letter of what Sutterly wanted. The following day, they walk off again, demanding 15-cent a day increase, matching what Kingston had given their workers. May 13th, and this is another picture's Haverstraw, just to fill. Here's guys, again, the process of working these machines. On May 13th, the International Union, this is Charles Hanks and Butterworth, they call for a general strike in the Upper Hudson Valley. They want plants from Kingston to Saugerties closed down, which is Port Ewing to Glasgow. The Coeymans owners at that point agree to give their men 5 cents, not 15, but not to everyone. You get 5 cents a day more if you're a molder or a sander. So that's the guys who are either putting the molds in or filling them with sand before they go to the molding. Truckers, wheelers, the guys actually pushing the bricks around in the carts, and you get 20 cents more a day if you're shoveling the pits. So those pits of clay ought to be shoveled into a bucket line. So those guys are getting 20 cents more a day. They'd asked for 15 across the board, so one group gets a little more, everybody else gets a little less. May 14th, the Argus, all the newspaper reports that Butterfield began to come back to Coeymans and was meeting with the union to talk about next steps in terms of what they could be doing in Coeymans to effectively get better terms. The Kingston Daily Freeman on May 15th reports that there's now a general strike that's been called by the International Union. It's not just Kingston to Saugerties, now it's Kingston all the way up to Albany. That is a general walkout called by the union president, Charles Hanks. At that point, same time, C.F. Sutterly begins the process of evicting 2 union activists from his housing, and those are reported as Tony Artemary, which I think is probably Tony Altamary, and Asa Moon, who is a black Virginia worker, both of whom were active in the union. That night, the union calls for a union meeting at Adamo Tavern. The men meet to talk about next steps in terms of the strike. Their biggest concern is that the union has not been able to unionize the black Southern workers, so they are still non-union labor, and how to deal with that. The meeting ends around midnight. So as we now go into May 16th, we find ourselves walking into the problem we're going to talk about. Now at this point, there are 5 brickyards operating in Coeymans. There's Ziegler and Ziegler with about 100 men, Corwin and McCulloch with about 50 men, Powell and Minnick have 110 men, Sutton and Zinzibah, which is an earlier iteration that John Sutton had with the Zinzibahs, was 125 men, and Sutton and Sutterly had the largest workforce of 250 men. On the morning of May 16th, the general strike in Kingston begins, and Saugerties, the Empire Brickyards at Coxsackie also walk off the job. At 3 a.m., the Italians, labor union Italians, send scouts out. The scouts go to all the brickyard workers' houses and basically say to them, join us or stay home tomorrow because there's going to be trouble. At 4 a.m., despite the warnings, the Southern black workers begin making their way to the brickyards. At 5 a.m., the Italian union workers, starting at the farthest yard north of Coeymans and working their way to the closest yard, which is Sutton and Sutterly, begin going yard to yard collecting men to step off the line. About 150 to 200 guys join them as they make their way to Sutton and Sutterly. As they get to the clay banks over Sutton and Sutterly, part of the men are left on top of the clay banks, the rest come around into the hamlet and head to the entrance to the brickyards, where they are met at 6:30 by Conrad Sutterly, his son John, Justin Bishop, and Under Sheriff Utley, who is the Coeymans sheriff, as well as about a dozen other management who are there to block entrance to the yard. Sutterly demands, according to reports, Sutterly steps up, demands the men to leave his property immediately. They have no reason to be there, they're not welcome, it's his property, please get off. And here's where it gets dicey. So at that point, according to the newspaper, the Italians brandish their guns. Everyone seems to have a revolver, as it's reported. At that point, you kind of get an Old West picture because it says, then Sutterly's men brandish their guns. So I can kind of see coats kind of going back. And the standoff stays there for a while, and then the report differs. According to one report, one side, Sutterly's side, one of the Italians waves his hat, and the men up on the bank start to fire, shooting down into the brickyard. At which point, Sutterly's men begin to fire into the crowd in front of them. The union says reverse. Sutterly's men fired first, obliging the strikers to then return fire. So there is no clear understanding what happens. So imagine gunfire going back and forth, coming from the hillside, coming from both sides of these guys, standing in a line, looking at each other, which the reporting, I think, is a little exaggerated. But at some point, Fred Southard, who is 22, he's a steam shovel operator, and he's working in the pit, is shot. Now, according to the newspaper, the X is where he was shot from. But as he's trying to, before being shot, he calls down to his assistant, who is a fellow named Henry Hoos. Henry, let's get, it's too hot here for me. The Albany Evening Journal made up half of their stories, but it's interesting. Hoos pulls Southard after he is shot. He exclaims, "I've been shot, Henry!" And Hoos pulls him up to 144, runs into town, gets a horse and cart to come and get Southard to take him to Dr. Reed in the hamlet. They were able to get word up to Ravenna to hold the 818 train. Reed and Southard are taken by carriage up to the train, where he's loaded onto the train and taken to Albany Hospital. His young wife and their 1-year-old child follow on the noon train. Southard survives, ends up moving to Pennsylvania, dies at the age of 76. There are multiple reports as you go to the different newspapers around the country about Fred. A couple of papers reported him as a black man, which he was not. Some report he was shot in the back, some report he was shot in the side, others report he was shot in the groin. The only thing I can tell you is his son Harold would be his only child. And you can deduce from that whatever you want. So now that the battle is underway, everybody goes for cover. And Sutterly reports later that when he tries to call to get help, the phone lines to the brickyards have been cut. So they run to the dock and they wave down a passing steamboat, which is the Ursula, which we see here, who comes into the dock, picks up Conrad, his son John, Justin Bishop, and takes them to Albany, which is about an hour by steamboat. Sheriff Utley is left at the dock. He takes a rowboat and goes back to the village downstream and finds a phone and calls for help to the sheriff. The trip to Albany once they arrive is to get in touch with a man named Sheriff Pitts. Pitts is the fairly newly elected sheriff of Albany County. And when Sutterly gets there, the first thing they do is they reach out to their attorney, Walter Ward. They don't go to the sheriff first, they go to Ward's office, they draft a memo which basically talks about the lawlessness going on in the hamlet of Coeymans and the danger and destruction to private property and public property. And interestingly enough, Sutterly and the lawyer put in there, the County of Albany will be held liable for any and all destruction and damage to said property by the mob, unlawful and legally assembled as aforesaid. So Sutterly's saying Albany County is going to be responsible if anything happens to his property, which is kind of ridiculous, but the sheriff took it seriously. So the sheriff receives the memo and and reaches out to his advisors, J. Sheldon Frost and Lieutenant Colonel Charles Davis, who's the commander of the 10th Regiment of the Army, for guidance. Pitts relays to these men what's been told to him by Sutterly, who is now at the sheriff's office. And according to the paper, Sutterly told him that the Italians were bloodthirsty and intent on murder and destruction and threatened to kill anyone who opposed them, also to burn buildings at the brickyard. The villagers in Coeymans demand protection for themselves and their homes, and there was danger that during the night the Italians, drunk and lawless, would riot and terrorize the village. Nothing but an armed force will bring the Italians to their senses. Pitts is convinced that, and this here we see Sheriff Pitts. Pitts is convinced that this is serious, as are his advisors. So they catch the next train down to Ravenna. They get the 11 o'clock train, or they get the 10 o'clock train, and by 11 a.m. they've been taken from the train down to Coeymans, where they set up a command center at the Gedney Hotel, which is on the corner of Westerlo and First. It's been going for many, many, many years. At that point, they try to arrange a carriage to take them, so it's Pitts, Frost, and Davis, to take them to the brickyards. They want to see the riot. They want to see the standoff. They want to understand what the problem is before, God forbid, they call out the army. And no one is willing to take them. No one wants to take a carriage because by now, word in the hamlet is that it's a war zone. So no one will bring them down, so they reach out to J.N. Briggs, a businessman who gives them or allows them use of his steam yacht. This is a facsimile, but a similar boat would have taken them down to look at the brickyards, which you see here, and their response when they returned was they didn't really see much of anything. It seemed pretty quiet. So they get back to the Gedney. By this time, business owners have assembled, and they begin to talk with the local businessmen and community fathers to see what the issue is, and all are very concerned. They all feel the village is in danger, and they urge Davis to call out the battalion. Pitts, Davis, Frost, Town Supervisor Warren Holmes, and Justice James Bailey finally agree that yes, they need to bring the army in to quell the riot. So Pitts, before he leaves, or Pitts doesn't leave, but before Davis leaves, Pitts swears in 20 local deputies and stations them at the south end of the Coeymans Bridge. So that would be this side, which is the south side. The bridge obviously was replaced many years ago. Most of the buildings you see here are gone. The brick building survives. Adamo's Tavern is just beyond it. Worker housing on the bottoms that we saw before. So we're going to keep people from going out to the brickyards, and nobody's coming into the village unless you're swimming across the creek. Davis returns on the next train, gets back to the 10th Regiment Armory, which is the Washington Avenue Armory, and puts out the call to mobilize the troops. By 3 p.m., they've held 7 cars at Union Station. The 2nd Battalion has been called in. The men begin to assemble, they get their uniforms, and it's the first time that the troops have been assembled since 1901 for the Union Traction Strike. Each man is given his rifle, a bayonet, and 20 rounds of multi-ball crowd control ammunition. 160 troops board the train for Coeymans at 3 o'clock and are sent off as if they're going to the Western Front. People are waving them, girlfriends are running alongside the train. No one expects these guys are going to make it back. They make their way to Coeymans and assemble. They march down Main Street. Just imagine this. 160 troops, fully armed, marching down Main Street, Church Street, up Coeymans, up Main Street, across the bridge, and they'll set up camp on the bluffs above Sutton and Sutterly, which are rye fields. And that's where Camp Lloyd is established. And thanks to the great collecting of our dear friend Harry Sturgis, we have this image of Camp Lloyd. And as you can see, rifles are stacked. You've got guys in uniform sitting, waiting for something to happen, and people just visiting the camp. It's interesting. 9:30, a second train is sent with more troops. Another 60 troops arrive, take the same march down. By midnight, water lines and phone lines have been run to the camp. The camp named in honor of Brigadier General James H. Lloyd, commander of the 3rd Brigade and 2nd Battalion. The following morning, Lloyd himself will take a motor car down to inspect the camp that's now named after him. Also at this time, all phone lines to the Italian quarter have been cut so that they can not communicate with the outside world. They don't want anyone calling for reinforcements from Albany or Coxsackie or any other place where the Union may have sympathizers. They also send out a notice that all saloons are to be closed, which is a big deal in Coeymans and Medina. So all the bars are told to be shuttered because we don't want anything to rile these guys up anymore. They also place armed guards around Conrad Sutterly's house, John Sutterly's house, and Justin Bishop's house. So these houses are now run by military troopers. The first report of the events come out of the Albany Evening Journal, which gives us one of the first stories. But it's on the same evening. We also find that we have reporting from the Evening Bee in Sacramento, California. We have the Topeka State Journal from Topeka, Kansas. We have reporting in the Scranton Times. We have reporting in the Charlotte News and the Washington Times, as well as the Evening Citizen in Ottawa, Canada. All the same day as Fred Southard is shot. And you'll notice a lot of it has to deal with deals with the idea of race war. Decidedly not. There are blacks in the Union. It's about union workers and non-union workers, regardless of race. There was no race in this at all. It was union versus management and strike breakers versus non-strike breakers. But the papers, depending on where they are, will carry the story differently. And that happens pretty consistently across several days. So how does the story get to Sacramento? You know, in the evening. Of course, there's a time difference, but still, it's making it to Sacramento and Ottawa, for God's sakes. So the way it's getting there is one of the fellows who comes down on the train, one of the troops, is a guy named Private Boothbay of Company A. And he's a telegrapher for the AP Press. So Private Boothbay sees a real opportunity. So he essentially sets up camp at the Ravenna train station telegraph office. And he starts doing war correspondent things. So he's sending out AP stories he's writing. And then as they're coming into different newspapers, they're being embellished or changed or updated. But Private Boothbay, you know, sees an opportunity to be a war correspondent. And by the time it's all over, he will be referenced as the war correspondent in Coeymans. So the next day, the 17th comes. And it starts off with a collection of people coming into the town to try to reestablish lawfulness. The first day, they issue several arrest warrants for 7 strikers, including one man who was identified as the shooter of Fred Southard. Sheriff Pitts and his men remain in Coeymans. They had stayed over at the Gedney, so they were ready to get up and running pretty early. Also that day, a number of press come down from Albany. So guys from the Argus, people from the Albany Evening Journal come into town. They want to see Camp Lloyd. They want to see what's going on. They're good journalists. They want to report on this. The Albany Evening Journal is a great photojournalist newspaper. All the pictures you see of the events are coming from them. The Argus has no pictures. They're just writing. And as part of the process, the reporters meet a fellow named Peter Whitbeck. And Peter Whitbeck lives in the Whitbeck house, which is at the top of Stonehouse Hill. Going down to the old Coeymans house, there's a house right at the top of the hill. That's the Whitbeck house. And Peter is described as being one of the oldest residents in the hamlet. At this point, he's 66. So the reporters are embellishing a little bit, but they interview Peter Whitbeck. And I can't show most of the interview because it makes you just cringe because of the difference in how we look at the world today. But the piece I'll read is what Peter was telling them about the Italians. And this is as reported, quoted, "They have a queer way of showing their feelings. They keep the priest down in the village busy, marrying and christening. I guess they haven't read Teddy's advice on race suicide, and it's just as well, for they don't need it. Well, when they come back from their weddings and christenings, why, they have a regular 4th of July. They fire off their guns." That's another story. They make a great old fuss. And after reflection, I guess they have a right to, for in many cases, they're celebrating the birth of new American citizens. But it makes one feel rather uncomfortable for the time being. They make good neighbors, those Italians, except when they get something in their heads that makes them excited. Then they go all to pieces. So that was kind of the introduction, and this whole interview is carried by the Argus. So among the men who were with Sheriff Pitts is his advisor, Sheldon Frost. Albany County DA George Addington will play into this more as they're arresting people. He's signing the arrest warrants. We've got a generic Sergeant Smith and an unknown deputy, according to the newspapers. So also on May 17th, the non-union workers go back to work under martial guard. So the troops are there, so all the black Southern workers just go back to work. Here, in this picture from the Albany Evening Journal, you can see Justin Bishop, who's labeled. He's giving the guys instructions of which machines are going to be operating, how the crews are going to be realigned, because we're missing a big chunk of the labor force. And a second image also from that day kind of shows the black labor kind of just doing their thing. They're wheeling their carts and bricks like nothing's going on, and the brickyards were calm. There was no, other than work going on, it was calm. But at the same time, there was also this search going on. They're looking for the 7 guys the arrest warrants are out on. They were also searching for guns and ammo. They were going door to door, searching houses, looking for weapons, which they were confiscating. And one of the first places they stopped at was the aforementioned Adamos Tavern. They go into James Adamo's Tavern. They find several shotguns, a bunch of handguns, and they find 600 rounds of ammunition, which has been stored in macaroni boxes, which I really enjoyed. The papers also note that this is a quote from the Italians were smart enough to hide their weapons. So when they went door to door, they really didn't find anything except for Adamo's Tavern. The rest of them had secreted their guns and their ammo outside or the perimeter or wherever, so they weren't found. At the same time, you have residents from Ravenna and the surrounding areas, again, still coming down, streaming in to tour the camp. They're looky-loos. They're stopping at the entrances to the brickyards to look in and see what's going on. They're visiting with the soldiers because there's really not much to do. And it's becoming this kind of tourist event. At the same time, word's been received that there are a group of Italians congregated at the Ravenna train station, and they're searching trains, passenger trains, as they come in. I'm thinking, maybe they were hiding, they'd gotten word out, guns are being hidden on the trains, and anyway, that's what the Army thought. So they sent 35 troops up the hill to the rail yard to kind of get these guys out of the station. On the way up, this is almost expected, on the way up they passed the halfway house, which should be closed under the orders from the troops, but they hear activity in there. So they bang on the door, and there's no answer. Everything goes quiet. So they demand to be let in. They're not, so they force their way in. As they force their way in, a bunch of Italians run out the back door. So the paper reports that the troops rounded them up, questioned them, and sent them home. Told the owner to close the halfway house. Simultaneously, Sheriff Pitts takes a contingent of troops to the old Coeymans house. They're looking for Vice President James Delmonico, who is the Vice President of the local union. They get there, they don't find him. Now, they've rung the entire building with troops. They've got troops stationed on the window so nobody jumps out of the window. And they bang on the door to be let in. They ask for Delmonico, he's not there, so the next best thing is they arrest his brother Ralph, who has no connection, he's not in the arrest warrant, but he's there, so they arrest him. The newspaper reports that this house, despite its one-time glory, has deteriorated into a second-rate Italian boarding house, but it still retains some of its pristine beauty. I wish Sylvia was here for that. Again, larger contingent of troops now. They've searched a number of houses. Now they're heading into the bottoms. They're going to the workers' housing. The contingent of troops gets to the hill leading down. They notice there's a large contingent of workers, Italian workers, have congregated amongst the housing and are holding a meeting. They kind of stop because the guys notice that there's these troops coming down the street towards them. So we have kind of a standoff going on. The troops halt. They send one of the Zieglers, who is a local family who spoke Italian. He goes down to speak to the workers, telling them the guys aren't here to make you go back to work. They're not going to force you to go back to work. They're just looking for these guys, these 6 guys. So after Ziegler goes back and forth between the groups for a while, it's decided the troops are just going to back away. They're not going to engage. Later that morning, they do find 3 of the perpetrators. Those are the guys dressed in suits between the armed guards, and kind of good-looking prisoners, top hat suits. So those guys are under arrest, and they're arraigned at Camp Lloyd by Town Justice Bailey. They're sent to the Albany County Jail on the next train. Similarly, they find Gabriel Securo. Remember Gabriel Securo from the 1905 census with 12 people living with his family? Gabriel Securo is arrested for shooting Fred Souther. All in all, the people arrested are John Mott, Pasquale Vito, Raphael DeMonico, who was not who they were looking for, Asa Moon, Frank Martino, Princey Martin, and the aforementioned Gabriel Securo. At the same time, being afraid that the Italians might expand the strike, they also sent troops to guard Lane and Oklahoma. Oklahoma is in old Coeymans parlance, everything from the point in Coeymans, kind of up past Clement Avenue. Harris Street, Clement Avenue, that's Oklahoma. And then Main Street from there going up to the railroad bridge, or before the thruway bridge, it was just a railroad bridge, is the lane. So they've got troops stationed all through that area in case these guys, who are predominantly rail yard workers, decide to go on strike or come down the hill and join their comrades at the brickyards. So now that part of town is also under guard. By the end of the day, the events are reported in the Nebraska State Journal, the Washington Post, the Ottumwa Weekly Courier, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and the Chicago Daily Tribune have also picked up the story now. Friday, May 18th, James Butterworth, our friend from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, who's been here a couple times, the vice president of the International Brick and Tile and Terracotta Workers, arrives in the village to help try to mediate this. He and one of his colleagues is picked up at the train station by troops. They're escorted down to the Gedney Hotel, where they will meet with the brickyard owners and Colonel Davis, as well as Sheriff Pitts. That meeting, of course, takes place at the Gedney Hotel. The meeting goes on for a while as they try to mediate the labor issues. And what comes out of it is that Butterworth really doesn't have a lot of negotiating room. Union, the workers say, the owners say there's no way. They're recognizing his union, so you can do this the easy way or the hard way. You can back your men down, or we'll just fire them all. In the end, they decide to call a general meeting at 3 o'clock on that day at Adam's Tavern to bring the workers together and announce what has come from this meeting. So the men who have met at the Gedney walk to Adam's Tavern. They bring in an interpreter named Joseph Lang from Albany because they didn't really trust local interpreters. And they pack these guys into the Adam's Tavern. There's about 100 people packed into the meeting hall at Adam's Tavern. It's completely surrounded by armed guards, and there's armed guards in the building protecting the entrances. Charles Butterworth speaks first. He tells the workers that he's sorry they took matters into their own hands and resorted to violence, which the union does not condone. As a result, he saw no way forward but to accept the owner's terms. Next up, C.F. Sutterly gets up to speak. He offers to take all the workers back, no questions asked, union, non-union. He agrees to keep the raise of 10 cents he had given back in May in place, not to pull that away from them. And he also agrees that he's going to cut the production of the machines from 25,000 brick a day to 22,500 a day, 22,500. Thus, although he's not giving them a raise, he's reducing the number of hours they're working. So, in essence, they make out better. He also makes an interesting point, that they'll be working less than 14 hours, 9 to 10 hours a day. He also states that he was paying his men $2.10 a day, which is about $73 a day. He compared that to the rail yards, which were only paying their men $1.14 a day, mostly for 14-hour days. So he's telling the guys, you're making twice as much money, you're working a third less hours. Why are you striking on me? I'm a good guy. The workers were happy to hear some of that, but they still were agitated. So there's a lot of chatter going on. Everybody kind of gets worried. At this point, Mr. Ziegler steps in again to interpret. Mr. Lang is kind of pulled to the side. And the workers are griping because they're happy that they can go back to work, but they're still concerned about the 6 guys that were arrested, saying, everybody was shooting. So you can't, those 6 guys, why them? There's no proof that they did anything. There's no way to prove that Salford wasn't shot by one of the deputies that was there. So why are we all, we want our guys released. So this goes on for a while. Sutterly finally stands up and states that he would go on the bail bond if they can be released on bail, but there's nothing more he could do. And of course, that's true, since he's the one who swore out the arrest warrants and got the Army to come down. It would look kind of silly now for him to say, okay, I'm withdrawing all this. So he agrees to go on the bail. But what's interesting is, bail was steep. It was $1,500 a guy, which is about $50,000 today. He doesn't pay it. He gets two merchants, Joseph Gould and Edward Long, put the money up for bail, not Sutherland. So I thought that was interesting. The workers applaud, they're happy, they go back to work. They really didn't gain anything, except for a couple days off. Fred Southard recovers. In the end, there really is not a big change than what happened. After the initial volley of bullets, the Italians went back to their houses. They just sat. They didn't do anything else. The Army came down. They really didn't do much except guard stuff, that there was no activity around it. So, all in all, kind of an interesting couple of days. The Albany Evening Journal wraps all of this up. And this is just another picture of the Journal took after the meeting as everybody pours out of the building. The Albany Evening Journal wraps up their coverage with this quote: the atmosphere of sullen discontent, bitter feelings, unrest, and anxiety has given place to one of hopefulness for the future, good feelings, and content. Thursday night, the Italian Quarter was dark as airless and as cheerful as a graveyard. Last night, every cottage was lighted as for a festive occasion. Music from the graphophone and violin mingled with the laughter and merry talk of the mercurial sons and daughters of the sunny country beyond the seas. What happened to that lawless, thieving mob? The News Herald finally gets in the reporting game because it happened between their publications. So they basically lead off with that the rail yards are offering 35-cent trips to come down and visit the boys, and with that you get a trip down to the Ravenna Rail Yard, and a carriage will take you down to visit the boys at the camp. On Monday, May 21st, troops break camp and head back to Albany. And the sad part about this is, while the Italians all got their jobs back, a lot of the soldiers who were called out went back and probably didn't have jobs anymore. Because there was no allowance that if you worked with the Guard, you would leave your job and come back to a job. You left, they got somebody else to fill your job. So, they talk about that kind of weird juxtaposition that's going on as part of this process. And inevitably what happens with all things is that cost becomes a factor. Now that everybody realizes it wasn't a revolt, people start tallying up the cost of the event. And one of the papers reports that it was all kind of unnecessary, and that all you really needed were a few stout deputies with a badge, a club, and a revolver. And you could have done had the same effect as the Army. The Argus placed the cost at about $6,000 for the 220 soldiers that were camped at Coeymans, which is about $250,000 today. And there was also talk that there were cavalry that did come down. There were some reports of cavalry returning. Couldn't verify that. The last paper to pick up any recording on this was the Cody Cowboy. In July of that year, the International Tile Workers Association took several pages of their international journal and recounted this entire story from the union side. And it's an interesting take on the story. It is very labor. I kept reading it like Frank Costanza from Seinfeld. It's kind of pro-labor reporting on it, but it's a very interesting take on all of the events that occurred. The last piece of news that I could find came from the Argus, and this is how they wrapped up their reporting with pie, sunshades, and the munitions of war. A group of war correspondents and landlord Reynolds of the Gedney House presented him, being A.D. Addington, with a large pumpkin pie of the house's best make. Inasmuch as Judge Addington had already had 5 pieces, he took the pie home with him externally on the train. So ended the Battle of Sutterly Hill. In all, the news was carried by the few days of news was carried in 31 states and 4 Canadian cities by over 90 newspapers. So for that 4 days, in May, Coeymans made the national news. Above the fold and above the rebuilding in San Francisco, which I found amazing. I close it with just telling you that the next threat of strike came 1 month later. What a ridiculous. Oh, and the last other thing, in one of the articles, Justin Bishop talks about the fact that Sheriff Utley, he was the most brave man he'd ever seen. He stepped to the front of everyone when he was facing the strikers and emptied his revolver into the crowd. Nobody hit anybody. Nobody did. So I'm kind of perplexed at how everybody's firing. The only guy that goes down is poor Fred Southard, who's sitting in a steam shovel, which you would think would give him protection.
What happened to the guys that went on, they got bond?
Gabriel Securo goes on to, I found him the next census living in Urbana.
Oh, yeah.
I knew his daughters. I would never guess that their father was accused of shooting Fred Southard. The rest of the guys, because they spelled the names differently, a lot of papers just reported on, they picked up these Italians, and one paper actually said, the names are too ridiculous for us to even try to spell. So it's hard to know whether the names changed, but, Asa Moon was from Virginia. Him and his son would come back up and live in Albany, but they're the only two I could really track down.
Okay.
They're demonicals.
Yeah, why were the black workers unwilling to join the strike?
I don't think they wanted to get in the middle of it. I just think they felt, because clearly the blacks and the Italians and Coeymans and the Brickyards co-mingled easily.
Right.
I think it wasn't their work ethic. It wasn't, I think the labor unions tended to be more with the Italian workers kind of coming out of their world, focused more on, they were more used to it. The black workers were like, we don't want any trouble with this stuff.
But you had no written version of what they were thinking.
No, and some of the black workers were in fact members of the union. Asa Moon arrested as part of it, so. Yeah.
Interesting, yep.